Festinger's cognitive dissonance study. The human mind will betray the truth for almost nothing. This experiment proves it, and it will blow your mind. Cognitive dissonance occurs when a person's behavior and beliefs no longer align. This conflict creates psychological discomfort. The mind will resolve that tension either by changing the behavior or by altering the belief. Leon Festinger wanted to test how far this process could go. In 1959, along with James Carl Smith, he ran an experiment that would become a foundational and unsettling piece of modern psychology. The task was deliberately designed to be tedious. Participants were brought in and asked to perform a repetitive activity for a full hour. They turned wooden pegs on a board, half rotations, row by row, using both hands, over and over again. The work was not stimulating. It offered no challenge. There was no creative thinking, no problem solving, no goal, just mechanical movement. Once finished, each participant was approached with a request. The researcher explained that they were short on staff and asked for a favor. Could the participant go outside and tell the next person, who was about to begin the same task, that it was actually enjoyable? In other words, lie. They were paid for this lie, but not equally. Half of the participants were offered $20, a significant amount at the time. The other half were offered only $1. After completing this final step, the participants were interviewed again. This time, the researchers asked how much they had actually enjoyed the original task. Here's where the contradiction emerged. Those who were paid $20 had no problem admitting the task was boring. They had lied, but they had been paid well to do so. The money justified the dishonesty. There was no internal conflict. Their belief about the task remained intact. It was tedious. Their behavior, lying about it, was clearly tied to external reward. But those paid only $1 showed a very different pattern. They couldn't fall back on the same justification. $1 wasn't enough to rationalize the lie, so their minds had to resolve the contradiction another way. They began to reframe the task itself. They claimed the peg turning had been sort of fun or more engaging than expected. Some even reported mild enjoyment. These weren't just superficial excuses. Their actual belief about the task had changed. The lie they told became a truth they accepted. This effect only emerged because the financial incentive was small. It wasn't enough to explain the behavior. The mind had to look inward for resolution. That resolution came in the form of altered memory and modified belief. The conclusion was simple, but deeply unsettling. When external justification is weak, people will internally reshape their beliefs to match their behavior, even if it means distorting reality. This wasn't a rare flaw, it was consistent. Across participants, those paid less were more likely to revise their memory of the task to eliminate psychological discomfort. The implications extend far beyond the lab. People invest years into jobs, relationships, ideologies, and personal sacrifices that don't bring the results they expected. But instead of admitting the effort was wasted, they reframe the failure as growth, or the suffering as strength. They tell themselves it was meaningful, because the alternative would be admitting they were wrong, misled, or exploited. This is why abusive systems often remain intact. Victims reframe their pain. Loyal followers rationalize broken promises. Individuals defend decisions that clearly contradict their own self-interest, because undoing the story would mean confronting cognitive dissonance directly. The mind's ability to resolve dissonance through belief revision is not a quirk. It is a self-defense mechanism. It preserves stability by any means necessary, including falsehood. Festinger's experiment proved that even trivial situations could trigger this distortion. A $1 lie was enough. That small discomfort rewrote memory, altered perception, and created an entirely new belief, one that felt real to the person holding it. The question is no longer whether we lie to ourselves. It's how often, and how deeply, we've already done it, without ever noticing. Zimbardo's Grasshopper study. Would you trust someone more if they treated you worse? This experiment tested that, and the results are hard to forget. Obedience is easy to explain when the person in charge is kind, fair, or charismatic. But what if the authority figure is cold, hostile, or unfriendly, and you still follow them? What if you end up justifying them, not just your actions. This is what psychologist Philip Zimbardo wanted to explore in 1965, years before his more infamous prison experiment, which we covered in detail in our other video on dark human experiments, linked in the description. The setup was simple, but the result revealed something deep and disturbing about how we make sense of our own behavior. Participants were asked to do something most people would instinctively reject: eat a fried grasshopper. They were told it was part of a military nutrition study. That wasn't unusual for the time. Psychological research often used military-style contexts for experimental framing. But the real manipulation wasn't the insect. It was the person delivering the order. Participants were randomly assigned to two conditions. Group A received the request from a friendly, warm, polite experimenter. Group B received it from someone who was cold, rude, and unfriendly. Both groups complied, reluctantly, and ate the grasshopper. But after the task, they were asked, "How do you feel about eating it? Would you do it again? What was your impression of the experience?" This is where the contradiction appeared. You'd expect Group A, the ones treated kindly, to report more positive feelings. But that's not what happened. The participants who were ordered by the rude experimenter reported enjoying the experience more. They rated it as more interesting, less unpleasant, more worthwhile. The logic makes no sense unless you understand dissonance. Here's what happened psychologically. For the group who liked the experimenter, the experience made sense. They did something uncomfortable, but for someone likable, no contradiction. But for the group who disliked the experimenter, there was no easy justification. Why would they comply with someone they didn't respect or enjoy? Why would they follow an order that came from someone abrasive? This created cognitive dissonance, a mental tension between their behavior, obedience, and their attitude, dislike. To resolve the contradiction, the mind changed the meaning of the action. They told themselves, "I must have eaten the grasshopper because I actually wanted to. It wasn't that bad, maybe even interesting." This made the act of obedience feel internally consistent, even though the behavior hadn't changed. Only the rationale did. Zimbardo's study revealed a subtle truth. People don't just obey authority, they rationalize their obedience, especially when it makes no emotional sense. This is how people come to admire toxic leaders, justify cruel treatment, or participate in degrading rituals. If they act under pressure, and the pressure doesn't come with kindness, they'll often rewrite their motivation to protect their self-image. And il peut authority. It also means that hostility from authority can backfire, not by reducing obedience, but by causing people to internalize the command more deeply, because the kinder the authority, the easier it is to explain your behavior as compliance. But the colder the authority, the more you need to own the behavior yourself. This finding shows up in other forms. In cults, where leaders are abusive, followers often become more committed, not despite the cruelty, but because they can't rationalize staying any other way. In military settings, where orders come without warmth or explanation, soldiers may come to own the ideology behind the action just to reduce internal conflict. In toxic workplaces, employees may end up defending harsh managers or degrading policies, because walking away would mean admitting they tolerated it for nothing. Zimbardo's grasshopper study didn't just test discomfort, it tested how far people would go to make meaning out of obedience, especially when obedience felt wrong. And the answer was clear. If they couldn't justify the authority figure, they would rewrite their own desire. They didn't eat the grasshopper because they were told to. They did it because they wanted to. Or at least, that's what their brain told them afterward. Asch conformity experiments. Would you say something you know is wrong just because everyone else said it first? Most people think they wouldn't. This experiment proved otherwise. We like to think of ourselves as independent thinkers, especially when the truth is obvious. But in the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch designed a study that shattered that illusion. It showed how easily people can be manipulated, not by force or threat or incentive, but by the quiet weight of group consensus. And all it took was a simple question about line lengths. The setup was deceptively simple. Each participant entered a room where they were told they'd be taking part in a vision test. They were shown a reference line, a single vertical black line, on a white card. Then they were shown a second card with 3 comparison lines labeled A, B, and C. One of these lines clearly matched the length of the reference line. The difference was obvious. It wasn't subtle. It didn't require judgment. There was a correct answer. Each person was asked to say out loud which line, A, B, or C, matched the reference. What they didn't know was that everyone else in the room was a confederate, an actor, in on the experiment. The real participant was always seated last or near last to hear everyone else's answers before giving their own. At first, the actors gave correct answers. The real subject followed suit, confidently. But then the manipulation began. On key trials, every single actor gave the same wrong answer, confidently, without hesitation. Now the real participant was faced with a dilemma. Trust their own eyes and disagree with the group, or conform and go along with something clearly false. The results were disturbing. Across multiple trials, 75% of participants conformed at least once, giving an answer they knew was wrong. When tested alone, participants got the correct answer over 99% of the time, but when surrounded by unanimous wrong answers, the conformity rate shot up to 37% across all critical trials. No threats, no rewards, just the presence of confident, unanimous agreement, and most people folded. Many participants later admitted they knew the group was wrong, but chose to conform anyway, just to avoid standing out, feeling awkward, or being the lone dissenter. Some even began to doubt their perception, questioning whether they had misjudged what they saw. Asch later introduced variations. If just one other person in the group gave the correct answer, conformity rates dropped sharply. If the subject wrote their answers instead of saying them out loud, conformity also declined. If the group wasn't unanimous, even with just one dissenter, participants were more likely to trust themselves. This revealed how fragile independent judgment can be when placed under silent pressure. The implications go far beyond a lab. Conformity shows up in classrooms, where students stay silent rather than challenge a popular but incorrect statement. In boardrooms, where executives nod along with a flawed plan. In political movements, where dissent is punished not with violence, but with exclusion and silence. People don't need to believe what they're saying. They just need to feel alone in thinking otherwise. And in that moment, many will give in, not because they believe, but because standing alone is harder than being wrong. Asch's experiment didn't expose a rare weakness. It revealed a basic social reflex. When truth and belonging conflict, belonging often wins. Most people aren't forced into obedience. They're gently nudged into agreement. One false smile, one fake nod at a time. And by the time they realize it, they're not just repeating what the group says. They're starting to wonder if maybe the group was right all along. Sherif's Autokinetic Effect study. What happens when there's no right answer, just silence, uncertainty, and other people guessing beside you? In the early 1930s, long before the conformity studies of Asch or Crutchfield, psychologist Muzafer Sherif designed an experiment that tested how people form beliefs in ambiguous situations. There was no pressure, no threat, just a dark room, a small point of light, and one question: how far did it move? What made this study powerful and quietly disturbing is that the light never moved at all. The experiment used something called the Autokinetic effect, a visual illusion that occurs in complete darkness. When a small stationary point of light is viewed in a pitch-black room, without any visual reference points, the light appears to move. It might seem to drift left, bounce up, or shake slightly, even though it's not moving at all. This is caused by tiny, involuntary eye movements and the brain's inability to anchor the image in space. Sherif realized that this illusion could be a perfect tool for studying social influence under uncertainty. Here's how the experiment worked. Participants were brought into a completely dark room and asked to focus on a small dot of light projected onto a screen. They were told the light would move and were asked to estimate how far it moved, in inches or centimeters. In reality, the light didn't move at all, but nearly every participant perceived movement because of the autokinetic effect. In the first phase, each participant sat alone and made a series of estimates over multiple trials. Some said it moved 1 inch. Others said 4 or 6. The estimates varied wildly because there was no objective reference point. Then came the second phase. Participants were placed into small groups of 3. Now, they were asked to call out their estimates out loud, in front of each other. What happened next was subtle but consistent. Over time, the estimates began to converge. People started adjusting their answers to move closer to the group, sometimes slightly, sometimes dramatically. By the end of multiple trials, most participants had aligned their estimates, even though no one had more information than anyone else. They had created a shared illusion, a group consensus about something that didn't exist. But Sherif didn't stop there. In the final phase, participants were brought back into the dark room alone again. No one else was present. No voices to follow. They were again asked how far the light had moved. Here's where the real insight appeared. Most people continued to give the group-aligned answer, even though they were now alone. They had internalized the group estimate. What started as a social compromise became a personal belief. The fake movement became a shared reality, and the shared reality became permanent. Sherif's study was one of the first to show that norms can form even in total uncertainty, and once formed, they stick. There was no correct answer, no authority figure, just social suggestion, repetition, and the brain's need to resolve ambiguity. This kind of conformity doesn't feel like pressure, it feels like clarity. We see this same effect today, in countless forms. In financial markets, where people follow investment trends simply because others seem to know what they're doing. In cultural taste, music, art, fashion, where preferences emerge through consensus, not individual judgment. In ambiguous situations, like public emergencies, where people freeze or follow the group, unsure what's actually happening. Sherif's work laid the foundation for decades of social psychology. It proved that belief doesn't always come from evidence. Sometimes it comes from agreement. And when reality is unclear, people don't look inward, they look sideways, even when there's nothing to see, and no one's right at all. Self-perception. What if you don't actually know what you believe until you see yourself act? That's what this experiment uncovered. When asked what we believe or who we are, most people assume they already know. They think beliefs come first, and then behavior follows. But Daryl Bem proposed something more unsettling. You observe yourself, just like you observe other people, and then you guess what you must believe, based on what you saw yourself do. In 1967, Bem challenged the dominant psychological model of internal belief. Instead of assuming we have full access to our thoughts and feelings, he argued that in many situations, we simply don't. So when we're asked to explain our actions, we fill in the blanks by watching our own behavior, then inventing a belief that fits. To prove it, he replicated Festinger's earlier cognitive dissonance experiment, but flipped it. He removed the inattention, and instead, tested whether belief could be shaped without discomfort at all, just through observation. Here's how it worked. Participants read detailed descriptions of a previous experiment, the same peg-turning task Festinger used. In the description, a subject was asked to lie and say the task was fun. Sometimes, the subject was paid $1 for lying. Sometimes, $20. The participants reading these scenarios weren't involved. They were outsiders, evaluators. They were then asked to guess, how much did the original subject actually enjoy the task? They consistently rated enjoyment higher when the subject had been paid only $1, even though the task was described as boring, even though the only difference was the payment amount. Why? Because the reader, like a psychologist, inferred the belief from the behavior. If they lied for just $1, they must have meant it. Otherwise, why would they say it was fun for so little? Bim's point was simple. This is what we do to ourselves. We watch our own behavior and infer what we must believe, just like an outside observer. This theory was tested again in variations. In one version, participants were asked to write essays supporting a position they disagreed with. Some were paid a small amount, others more. Later they were asked about their actual beliefs on the topic. Again, those paid less were more likely to report having shifted their opinion, but not because they felt dissonance. There was no conflict, they just assumed, if I said it, maybe I believe it. In another variation, Participants who chose between two nearly identical products later rated the one they picked as better. Not because it actually was, but because they had chosen it, and their mind filled in the belief afterward. This is self-perception in action. You infer your beliefs from your own behavior, and you don't always realize you're doing it. The implications are wide-reaching and uncomfortable. Someone who hears themselves defending a political view may become convinced they actually believe it, just because they spoke it aloud. A person who volunteers to help might conclude, "I must be generous." Someone who laughs at a joke they didn't find funny may later report enjoying it, because their own behavior wrote the memory. In relationships, the more effort someone gives, the more likely they are to say, "I must love them," even if the connection is unclear. This theory removes the illusion of inner certainty. You are not just a thinker, you are a watcher. And often, you only know what you believe, because you've observed your own actions and reconstructed the belief from the outside in. Self-perception theory doesn't replace cognitive dissonance, it complements it. Where dissonance is driven by conflict, self-perception happens in the absence of conflict. It's smoother, quieter, more dangerous, because it's harder to notice. You think your beliefs guide your actions, but sometimes it's the other way around. You act, then invent the belief to explain it, and the moment that explanation feels right, the belief becomes real. The Good Samaritan experiment. Imagine this. You're walking to an appointment. You pass a man slumped in a doorway, coughing, groaning, clearly in pain. You glance, but you're running late. You keep walking. Minutes later, you remember what you saw and feel a knot of guilt, the kind that lingers. Now the question is, are you a bad person, or was something else controlling your decision? In 1973, two psychologists, John Darley and Daniel Batson, set up a real-world experiment to find out. They wanted to test how external pressures, like being in a hurry, could override a person's internal morality, even in people who considered themselves deeply ethical, and the group they chose to test it on, seminary students, men training to be priests. The setup, Princeton Theological Seminary, 1973. The researchers recruited 40 male theology students. They were told they'd be giving a short speech across campus, either about career paths in ministry, or about the parable of the Good Samaritan, a biblical story about helping strangers in need. Before the speech, each participant was individually interviewed in one building. Then they were instructed to walk to another nearby location to deliver their talk. But there was a twist. The researchers manipulated one variable, time pressure. The students were split into 3 conditions. One group was told, "You're late. They were expecting you a few minutes ago. Please hurry." A second group was told, "You're right on time, but head over now." And the third group was told, "You're early. No rush at all. Same topic, same walk." The only thing that changed was how rushed they felt. Now here's where it gets dark. The hidden confound, a man in need. Along the path to the speech location, the researchers planted a Confederate, a young man slumped in a doorway, head down, coughing, and groaning in visible discomfort. He didn't beg, he didn't speak, he was just there, clearly suffering, in the path of each student. And now the real test began. Would they stop, would they help, or would they walk past? The results were shocking. In the low-hurry condition, students told they had plenty of time. 63% stopped to help. In the on-time group, told to head over promptly, 45% offered help. But in the high-hurry group, told they were running late, only 10% stopped. That's right, 9 out of 10 stepped over a man in distress while on their way to give a talk about helping others. One of the participants, in a follow-up interview, reportedly said, "I was going to give a talk on the Good Samaritan, and I literally stepped over someone who needed help." He wasn't being ironic. He just didn't connect the moment to the message. Why did this happen? Darley and Batson concluded that morality is highly context-sensitive. Most of these students were not uncaring. They were thoughtful, committed, and preparing for religious service. But when placed under time pressure, their focus narrowed. The brain switched to task mode. Get there, deliver the talk, don't be late. And in that mental state, the suffering man became background noise. What the experiment proved is this: Your ethical behavior isn't just shaped by your values, it's shaped by your schedule. Even more disturbing, the topic of the speech had no effect. Students speaking about compassion and moral duty were just as likely to walk past the man as those speaking about career advancement. The content in their head didn't reach their behavior because their behavior was being dictated by urgency. Think about what this means. You could walk past someone in pain, not because you're heartless, but because your calendar is full, because you're trying to get somewhere, because you're thinking I'll help later, but later never comes, and the person, the one who needed you, is left alone. The Good Samaritan experiment shattered the illusion that morality is stable. It showed that external pressures like time, stress, or routine can completely override your ethical instincts without you even realizing it. And maybe the scariest part is the people most likely to step over someone in need might be the same ones preparing to teach others about kindness. When prophecy fails. In 1954, a woman named Dorothy Martin believed the world was going to end. She claimed to receive messages from aliens, beings from the planet Clarion, who told her that a great flood would destroy Earth on December 21st. Only true believers would be saved. They had to prepare, leave jobs, sell belongings, abandon family, spread the word, and they did. A small group formed around her, drawn from various professions, housewives, students, engineers. They believed completely. They referred to themselves as the Seekers. They were convinced the message was real. What they didn't know was that their belief system had become the subject of a hidden psychological experiment. Psychologist Leon Festinger, along with Henry Rieken and Stanley Schachter, infiltrated the group. They posed as new believers, took notes in secret, and waited for the prophecy to fail. Because it would fail, there was no spaceship, there would be no flood, and what happened next revealed something terrifying about the human mind. December 21st came. Nothing happened. No flood, no destruction, no aliens. The world continued, normal, undisturbed. For a few moments, the group sat in silence, shocked, disoriented. Some cried, some stared into space. But within hours, everything changed. Dorothy claimed to receive a new message from the aliens. The flood had been cancelled. Because of them, their faith had saved the world. What followed was not embarrassment, not retreat, not doubt. The group became more committed than ever. They doubled down. They began contacting newspapers. They tried to recruit new members. They spread the message louder and farther than before. Even though the original prediction had failed completely, Festinger and his team had predicted this exact outcome. In fact, they coined the term cognitive dissonance from what they observed in this experiment. When deeply held beliefs are shattered by reality, the mind enters crisis. But instead of abandoning the belief, especially if they've sacrificed heavily for it, people often choose to reinterpret reality to preserve the belief. The cost of abandoning the prophecy was too high. These people had quit jobs, ended relationships, publicly committed to a false vision. If they admitted it was all a lie, they would have to confront shame, regret, and meaninglessness. To avoid that pain, they chose to reframe the event. Not as a failure, but as a victory. Their belief saved the world. They weren't wrong. They were heroes. This is dissonance resolution in its rawest form. When truth threatens identity, identity wins. The disturbing insight is this: we are not wired to follow evidence. We are wired to protect our beliefs, especially the ones we've paid for in suffering. You see it in cults, conspiracy movements, political extremism. Even when leaders are exposed or predictions fail, the followers don't leave. They justify harder. They push deeper. Because walking away means admitting they were fooled, and most people would rather twist reality than face that kind of self-betrayal. Festinger's field study wasn't just about a failed prophecy. It was about the mind's ability to protect its story at all costs. This was not an obscure religious fringe. It was a cross-section of ordinary, educated people, capable of astonishing levels of self-deception when their worldview was under threat. Cognitive dissonance isn't a moment of discomfort. It's a fracture in identity. And when that fracture appears, Your mind doesn't warn you. It adapts in silence and brings you with it. The prophecy didn't come true, but the damage was already done. The lie had been absorbed, and once it's inside, the mind makes it real. Marshmallow Test. In the late 1960s, a group of preschoolers were brought into a quiet room at Stanford University. They sat alone at a table, and in front of them was a single marshmallow. Then came the offer. They were told, "You can eat this marshmallow now. Or, if you wait until I come back, you can have 2 marshmallows instead." Then the adult left the room, and the timer started. What followed became one of the most iconic and unsettling psychological experiments ever conducted, because what these children did in those next few minutes would come to define decades of research on self-control, impulse, and delayed gratification. This was the work of psychologist Walter Mischel at Stanford's Bing Nursery School around 9. The goal was to test how young children, mostly aged 4 to 6, would handle a simple temptation. The setup was always the same. A child sits alone in a room. On the table is a treat, usually a marshmallow, sometimes a cookie or pretzel. The adult explains, "If you wait until I come back, you'll get 2. If the child rings a bell or eats the marshmallow before that, the test ends. They get only 1. Then the adult walks out, and the child is left alone, with nothing but the marshmallow and their own thoughts." Some kids lasted seconds. They stared, sniffed, licked, touched, and finally ate it. Others covered their eyes, sang to themselves, kicked the table. One lay flat on the floor, humming, trying not to look, but a few waited, entirely, 10, 12, even 15 minutes. The researchers tracked exactly how long each child waited, down to the second. But what made the marshmallow test truly disturbing was what came years later. Mischel and his team followed up with the same kids, years after the original test, into adolescence, then adulthood, and they found a pattern. The children who waited longer in the marshmallow test scored higher on SCTs, had lower levels of substance abuse, maintained healthier body weight, showed better coping skills under stress, and were rated by parents and teachers as more competent, confident, and socially skilled. Meanwhile, those who gave in quickly, often within a minute, were more likely to struggle with focus, frustration, and planning, all from a decision made in preschool, over a single marshmallow. But how? How could one small act of self-control predict so much? Researchers believed it wasn't about the marshmallow itself, but about how children managed impulse. The ones who waited weren't just more patient. They were using active strategies to distract themselves, turning away, pretending the marshmallow was just a picture, covering their eyes, singing, imagining something else. In other words, they regulated emotion and attention, and that skill, not willpower, but mental flexibility, became their long-term advantage. In later studies, Mischel tweaked the experiment. In one version, children were given verbal strategies before the test. They were told, "If you pretend the marshmallow is a cloud, it'll be easier to wait," and it worked. Kids given even a simple distraction technique waited twice as long, which showed something powerful. Self-control isn't fixed. It can be taught, trained, strengthened. But here's where it gets complicated. In 2018, a replication study was published with over 900 children, far larger than the original sample. It found that while waiting times still predicted some outcomes, those effects disappeared when the researchers controlled for socioeconomic background. In other words, kids from wealthier, more stable households waited longer not just because of self-control, but because they trusted that the second marshmallow would actually come. For some children, waiting wasn't smart, it was risky. If your life teaches you that promises are often broken, you take what's in front of you. So what did the marshmallow test really prove? It showed that impulse control matters, but also that context, trust, and learned strategies shape behavior deeply. It's not just about who you are, it's about what the world has taught you to expect. Time perception warping. 2 minutes waiting for a microwave can feel like forever. But a 2-hour conversation with someone you love can disappear in a blink. What's happening here isn't just mood. It's your brain's internal clock, and it's far easier to fool than you think. Psychologists have studied this for decades. They've put people in isolation tanks. They've tested them with flashing lights, loud noises, and blank walls. And what they found is that your perception of time is one of the least reliable things about your consciousness. It can warp, it can collapse, and under the right pressure, it can vanish completely. Let's start with a foundational experiment. In 2004, psychologist David Eagleman ran a study to test what happens to time perception during fear. He and his team built a device called the perceptual chronometer, a screen that flashed numbers too quickly to normally be read. Then they sent participants, one at a time, to a 200-foot free fall. They were strapped into a harness and dropped backward from a tall tower in complete safety, but with no control. As they fell, they looked at the chronometer strapped to their wrist. Before the fall, they couldn't read the flashing numbers. They were too fast, but during the fall, during that spike of adrenaline and fear, some participants could suddenly read the numbers clearly. It wasn't that time actually slowed down. The display speed never changed, but the brain was recording more information per second, creating the feeling that time had stretched out. Now consider a different kind of warping, not from fear, but from boredom. In 2012, researchers at the University of Lyon in France conducted a study on monotony and time distortion. Participants sat alone in silent rooms, with no phone, no clock, and nothing to do. Some waited 5 minutes, others waited 20. Then they were asked, "How much time do you think has passed?" The results were striking. In the 5-minute group, over half guessed 10 minutes or more. In the 20-minute group, some guessed over an hour. The less stimulation the brain received, the more time stretched in their internal experience. Another famous version of this comes from drug studies. In a 1971 experiment by psychologists at Johns Hopkins, participants were administered small doses of marijuana or placebo. After the drug took effect, participants were asked to estimate how much time had passed between two audio tones. Across the board, those under THC influence overestimated time, sometimes by 50 to 70%. Their internal clocks had sped up, even though the world had not. So what controls this internal clock? Research points to a few major factors: emotion, attention, memory, encoding, and the density of stimuli per second. Here's how it works. When you experience more information, your brain creates more time markers. This makes the moment feel longer in retrospect. That's why novelty stretches time. Your first week in a new city feels longer than your 10th. Why? Because your brain is storing every little detail, instead of skipping over what it already knows. And the reverse is true too. Repetition, routine, familiarity, all of these lead to temporal compression. You go through the motions. You forget days. You say, "Where did the time go?" Because your brain stopped recording distinct moments. Time didn't disappear. You just stopped remembering it. Even age warps time. In a classic 1990 study, adults of all ages were asked to describe the pace of time in childhood versus adulthood. Almost every participant said the same thing: time moved slower when I was young. Not because their days were longer, but because each moment was new. Now days blur together. Neuroscientists believe this is due to declining novelty and compressed memory encoding. To put it simply, as we age, we stop noticing life in detail, and time collapses. As a result, time perception is not just inaccurate, it's not even your own. It changes depending on mood, fear, drugs, light, sound. It compresses entire years and stretches out a 5-minute wait into eternity. And you never feel it happening. You just wake up one day and wonder where it all went. The Invisible Gorilla, 1999. If something was right in front of you, something strange, something impossible, would you notice? You probably think yes. Most people do. We believe we're aware of our surroundings, that our attention is reliable, that if something completely out of place happened in front of us, we'd see it. In 1999, psychologists Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons ran a now famous experiment to test that belief. And what they found is quietly terrifying. Even when something as obvious as a person in a gorilla suit walks through a scene, most people don't notice it. Here's how the experiment worked. Participants were told they'd be watching a video of two teams passing a basketball. One team wore white shirts, the other team wore black. The task was simple: count how many times the players in white shirts passed the ball to each other. That's all. No trick, no time limit. Just stay focused and count the passes. Participants watched closely, eyes locked on the ball, mentally tracking the number. But midway through the video, something bizarre happens. A person dressed in a full-body gorilla costume casually walks into the scene. They stop in the middle of the players, they pound their chest, then they walk out. The event lasts about 9 seconds. The gorilla is in plain view. It walks slowly, it doesn't hide. Then the video ends, and the experimenter asks, "Did you see the gorilla?" Roughly half the participants said no, they never saw it. They were so focused on counting passes that they completely missed a 6-foot-tall gorilla walking through the frame. Even when shown the video again, many participants didn't believe it. They were sure it had been edited or changed. Some laughed nervously, others were disturbed. But the video hadn't been edited. Their minds had edited the experience. This effect is called inattentional blindness, the failure to notice something clearly visible because your attention is focused elsewhere. It's not about eyesight. It's about the limits of conscious attention. Chabris and Simons didn't stop there. They created other versions of the video, changing the number of players, the difficulty of the counting task, or replacing the gorilla with other unexpected events. A curtain changing color in the background. A player leaving the scene, a new person entering unnoticed. The result was always the same. When people are focused, they become blind. This raises disturbing questions. How much are we missing in our daily lives? Not because it's hidden, but because we're distracted. How much of what we think we saw never actually entered our awareness? It explains why eyewitness testimony is so unreliable, why drivers miss pedestrians, even in clear weather, why surveillance footage misses obvious events, even when being reviewed in real time. We assume attention is like a camera, always on, always recording. But the brain doesn't work that way. It filters, it narrows, it prioritizes task over reality. Pluralistic ignorance. What happens when everyone privately disagrees, but stays silent, thinking everyone else agrees? Sometimes, entire groups follow norms they don't believe in, not because they're pressured to comply, but because each person mistakenly assumes everyone else believes. This is called pluralistic ignorance. It's not about obedience, it's not about lying. It's when people suppress their true beliefs, because they wrongly believe they're the only one who disagrees. Psychologists wanted to test how far this effect could go, especially in high-stress situations where speaking up might matter. One of the clearest demonstrations came from a 1970s study by Bibb Latane and John Darley, the same researchers who later formalized the Bystander Effect. The experiment setup was simple but precise. Participants were invited to a psychology lab and told they'd be filling out a survey to help with research on urban life. Each person was placed in a small room, seated at a desk with a clipboard and questions. But the real test wasn't on the paper. It was how they'd respond when something went wrong. A few minutes into the session, smoke began to enter the room through a vent. Not immediately dramatic, just a small stream at first, then harmless. Then slowly thicker. After 4 minutes it was hard to ignore. After 6, visibility in the room was noticeably reduced. What the researchers wanted to know was this: would the participant report the smoke? Would they treat it like an emergency? Would they say something? The participants were placed in different conditions. Alone, just the participant in the room, with 2 passive confederates, actors trained to ignore the smoke, with 2 real participants creating a situation where everyone was uncertain and looking to each other. The results were stark. When participants were alone, about 75% reported the smoke or left the room to find help. When placed with 2 passive confederates, only 10% reported it. The rest sat there, coughing, blinking, but doing nothing, even as the room visibly filled with smoke. In groups of 3 naive participants, the number dropped again. Only about 38% took action. The smoke was real. The discomfort was real, but people suppressed their instincts because no one else moved first. Even participants who showed clear signs of anxiety, fidgeting, hesitating, repeatedly glancing at the vent, stayed silent. Afterward, many said they assumed they were overreacting, that if no one else is worried, it must be fine. This is pluralistic ignorance. Everyone privately doubts, but everyone stays silent, and the silence is misread as consensus. In a follow-up version, the smoke became even thicker, to the point that it made people squint and cough. Still, in group settings, most people refused to act unless someone else did first. It wasn't fear of punishment. It wasn't social pressure. It was the illusion that everyone else believed it wasn't a problem, and so the individual overrode their own perception. This phenomenon appears everywhere. In classrooms, when no one asks a question, because they assume everyone else understands. In social settings, when people laugh along with offensive jokes they don't find funny. In organizations, when no one questions a flawed policy because they believe they're the only one with concerns. And in public crises, when bystanders freeze, not from apathy, but from uncertainty and silence. What makes pluralistic ignorance disturbing is how fragile the illusion is. Break the silence, and the illusion often collapses. But until then, entire groups can operate in quiet disconnection from their actual beliefs. The bystander effect. If someone was dying just meters away, would you help? What if you weren't the only one who heard them? In 1964, a woman named Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death outside her apartment building in Queens, New York. The early news reports claimed that 38 people witnessed the attack, and no one intervened. While that number was later challenged, the core question remained: why didn't anyone help? Psychologists Bibb Latane and John Darley were among the first to respond, not with opinion, but with an experiment. They wanted to know, does the presence of other people reduce a person's likelihood to act in an emergency? And if so, how far does it go? They designed a study that removed every possible excuse. No physical danger, no ambiguity, no uncertainty, just a voice on the other side of a wall. And it still worked. The experiment was conducted in 1968 at New York University. Participants were told they were part of a study on college student life and personal problems. To encourage openness, they were told the discussion would take place via intercom system, and that each person would speak one at a time. Importantly, they were told the conversation would be private, even though other participants were listening. What the subjects didn't know was that all other voices were pre-recorded, and the real test wasn't about what they said, it was about what they'd do next. During the session, one of the recorded participants introduced himself and admitted to suffering from seizures under stress. In the second round, that same voice began to stutter, panic, and then escalate. I'm feeling really bad. My chest hurts. I can't breathe. Help me, please. Then silence. This wasn't subtle. It was a direct simulation of a medical emergency. The question was simple. Would the real participants seek help, and how did their behavior change, depending on how many others they believed were listening? Participants were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. They believed they were the only one listening. They believed 2 other people were present. They believed 5 people were part of the call. What Latane and Darley found was disturbing. When participants thought they were the only one, 85% left the room quickly and tried to get help. When they thought 2 others were present, that number dropped to 62%. When they believed 4 others were on the call, only 31% took action. And not just slower, many never helped at all, even though they heard a seizure, even though they were safe, even though the person might be dying. Some later said they thought others were handling it. Some said they weren't sure it was real. Some admitted they didn't want to overreact. This was diffusion of responsibility in its purest form. The more people you believe are watching, the less pressure you feel to do something, because you assume someone else will, even if no one does. This experiment has been repeated in variations. People failing to report theft or injury in crowded settings. delayed responses to fire alarms when others stay seated, passivity in the face of fainting, harassment or aggression, all because others appear unbothered. The conclusion is always the same. When everyone assumes someone else will act, no one does. In Dali and Latane's study, no real person was in danger, but the hesitation was real. The guilt, the indecision, the inaction, all real. And if it happens in a clean university lab, with no threat, what happens when the emergency is messy, confusing, or dangerous? Future self-continuity. You know you should save more, eat better, sleep earlier, plan ahead. You know your future depends on the choices you make now. But most people don't follow through. Why? Psychologists have discovered a disturbing answer. Many people don't feel connected to their future self. In fact, their brain treats it like a stranger. That's not a metaphor. That's been measured in real experiments. And when the brain sees your future self as someone else, you begin to treat them worse, just like we often do with people who aren't us. This is the core of what psychologists call future self-discontinuity, and researchers have tested it in fMRI labs, behavioral trials, and even financial simulations. The most famous work comes from psychologist Hal Hershfield at Stanford University. In one of his earliest experiments, participants entered an fMRI scanner, a machine that maps brain activity in real time. They were asked to imagine 3 different people, themselves, right now. A close, familiar person, like a friend or family member, themselves, 20 years in the future. As they visualized each one, the researchers watched which areas of the brain lit up. Here's what they found. When participants thought about their current self, the medial prefrontal cortex, the region associated with identity, showed strong activation. Same thing when thinking about a close friend. But when they thought about their future self, brain activity dropped dramatically and shifted to regions normally used when thinking about strangers. In other words, many people's brains treat their future self as if they are someone else. This wasn't just a neural curiosity, it had real behavioral effects. In a follow-up study, participants were asked to make a decision. They were given a small amount of money. They could keep it now or set it aside in a retirement account for their future self. Before deciding, some participants were shown digitally aged photos of themselves, created using facial transformation software. When they saw a realistic image of what they'd look like at age 65 or 70, something shifted. They felt more empathy, more identification, and they saved twice as much money as those who didn't see the aged image. The simple act of visualizing a future self and realizing that's still me changed behavior in the present. This effect has been tested across health behavior, like exercise and diet choices, academic decisions, like studying versus procrastinating, and even ethical choices, such as whether to cheat when consequences are delayed. In every case, the pattern is the same. The more someone feels disconnected from their future self, the more likely they are to betray that person's well-being. It's not a failure of willpower, it's a failure of identification. In one version of the study, participants were told to write a letter from their future self, thanking them for decisions made today. Others were told to write a letter to their future self, apologizing for poor habits. Both groups showed stronger future self connection afterward. They were less impulsive, more careful, more motivated. Just taking a moment to picture who you're becoming can strengthen the bridge between now and then. But not everyone has that connection. In fact, in a large survey of over 2,500 adults, researchers found that over half felt little or no emotional link to their future self beyond 10 years. Some said it felt vague, others said it felt like thinking about another person's life entirely. And here's the dangerous part. When your future feels like someone else's problem, you stop protecting it. You eat poorly, you avoid planning, you take on debt, and all of it gets handed to a version of you that doesn't quite feel like you. The future self-continuity studies uncovered something quietly tragic. We often neglect our future not out of laziness, but out of emotional distance. But here's the hopeful part. That distance can shrink. Seeing yourself aged, writing to or from your future self, vividly imagining a moment, 10 or 20 years from now, talking about your long-term plans, out loud. All of these have been shown to increase that sense of connection, and with it, better decisions today. The question isn't just what kind of person you'll become, it's whether you'll still feel like that person is you by the time it matters most. Ben Franklin Effect. You'd think people like you more when you do them favors. But the truth is, stranger, they like you more when they do you a favor. Even if they disliked you before, even if they still do, that contradiction is what makes this effect disturbing, because it means affection, trust, and loyalty can be manufactured, not by giving, but by taking. And it's not just a theory. This was observed, measured, tested. The effect is named after Benjamin Franklin, who used it politically in the 1700s. He had a rival, someone vocal, powerful, and hostile toward him. Franklin didn't try to win him over with kindness. Instead, he made a simple request. He asked to borrow a rare book from the man's private collection. The rival complied. A week later, Franklin returned the book with a polite thank you note, and noticed a shift. The hostility disappeared. The man became warmer. Eventually, he became a supporter. Franklin realized something. People justify their actions not by logic, but by reshaping how they feel. If they helped you, they must like you. Otherwise, why would they have helped you? That's cognitive dissonance in motion. But Franklin's story was just the beginning. In the 1960s, psychologists Jecker and Landy tested this phenomenon in a controlled experiment. Participants first took part in a mock game show-style quiz with a cash prize. After the game, the researcher used one of three tactics. He personally asked some participants to return the money as a favor. Others were asked by a secretary on behalf of the department, a more impersonal request. A control group kept the money, with no request made. Later, all participants were asked how much they liked the researcher. The results were clear. The people who returned the money, especially those who did so as a personal favor, rated the researcher significantly higher in likability. The people who kept the money, no change. Those asked, impersonally, little effect. But those who gave something up for him, their minds rewrote the narrative. If I helped him, maybe I don't dislike him after all. And that belief became real. This effect has been replicated in variations. People rate those they've helped as more trustworthy, more likable, more deserving, even when the person didn't earn it, even when the original feelings were negative. Why? Because doing something generous for someone you dislike creates tension. The behavior and the emotion don't match. And instead of admitting to acting irrationally, the brain takes a shortcut. It edits the emotion. It alters memory. It manufactures a retroactive reason for your behavior. This flips common sense. We believe feelings drive behavior, but often, behavior changes first, and feelings adjust afterward to fit. In real life, this is used everywhere. In sales, when a client does a small favor, like taking a survey, they become more receptive to the salesperson. In abusive relationships, victims are manipulated into helping their abuser, creating false emotional justification. They must be worth helping. In politics, loyalty deepens not because leaders deliver results, but because people have invested time, voice, and identity. They've helped the cause, and now they believe in it more. In cult recruitment, newcomers are assigned small tasks early on. That effort is reframed into emotional connection. Loyalty grows. Even when the ideology doesn't make sense, the mind demands consistency. When behavior violates belief, belief is the one that bends. The Ben Franklin effect isn't about kindness. It's about control. It shows that you don't need to earn someone's affection. You just need to get them to act in your favor. Once, the brain will take care of the rest. And the scariest part? You don't feel the shift. The belief change is silent. You just wake up one day feeling closer to someone because you gave them something. Effort justification study. How far would you go to convince yourself something was worth it after it clearly wasn't? This experiment answers that, and it's unsettling. We assume we suffer because something is valuable, but the human mind often flips that around. Something becomes valuable because we suffered for it. In psychology, this is called effort justification, the tendency to assign greater value to outcomes that required more effort, even if the reward doesn't match. It's not just flawed logic, it's a defense mechanism, because the alternative, admitting that all the pain, stress, or humiliation was for nothing, is often too uncomfortable to accept. In 1959, psychologists Elliot Aronson and Judson Mills designed a study to expose this mechanism in action. Participants were told they were applying to join a discussion group about sex and personal relationships, a taboo topic at the time. But there was a catch. To join the group, they had to go through a screening process. There were 3 groups. Group 1 experienced a severe initiation. They had to read aloud highly explicit sexual content and taboo words in front of an authority figure. Group 2 had a mild initiation, reading slightly embarrassing but not graphic words. Group 3 had no initiation at all. After completing the screening, all participants were allowed to listen to a discussion supposedly conducted by the group they had just joined. What they heard was deliberately designed to be dull, awkward, and disappointing. The audio was scripted. The discussion was dry. The participants on tape were slow, disorganized, and obviously uninteresting. Then came the evaluation. Participants were asked, how intelligent, interesting, and worthwhile was the discussion? The results were striking. The people who went through no initiation said exactly what you'd expect. The discussion was boring and unappealing. The mild initiation group gave slightly more favorable feedback, but still largely negative. But the severe initiation group, the ones who had undergone the most embarrassment, rated the discussion as far more interesting, intelligent, and engaging than it actually was. They weren't lying. They weren't pressured. Their minds had reframed the experience, because admitting that they endured humiliation just to join a boring group would have created cognitive dissonance, a painful mental contradiction. To resolve it, their brains changed the perceived value of the outcome. The effort made it feel worthwhile. This mechanism explains a huge range of irrational loyalty and long-term attachment. People who undergo painful hazing rituals report stronger group loyalty, not despite the abuse, but because of it. Victims of abusive relationships may stay, not only due to fear or control, but because leaving would mean admitting that the time, effort, and forgiveness they gave was wasted. Unpaid internships, underpaid jobs, or grueling boot camps are often justified by framing them as valuable experiences, regardless of the actual outcome. We don't want to admit we've been exploited. We don't want to believe we were manipulated or misled. So we turn the suffering into a story of meaning. The more we pay in time, pain, or dignity, the more convinced we become that the result must be worth it. This makes the mind vulnerable to exploitation, because the more someone forces you to invest, the more committed you become, not because of truth, but because of cost. Aronson and Mills' study didn't rely on fear, authority, or deception. It revealed how effort alone can rewrite perception. The human mind doesn't tolerate wasted pain, so it repackages that pain as purpose. And if you're not careful, that mechanism can trap you in jobs, ideologies, relationships, or beliefs that you would have walked away from if not for how much you already gave. The mere exposure effect. What if repetition alone could control what you like, who you trust, and even who you fall for? This experiment tested exactly that. We tend to think we choose our preferences rationally, that we like what we like for a reason, because it's attractive, useful, or good. But research shows something much simpler and more manipulative. The more often you're exposed to something, the more likely you are to like it, even if you didn't notice it, even if you didn't like it before, even if it has no value at all. This is called the mere exposure effect, and it was first studied in detail by psychologist Robert Zajonc in 1968. Zajonc conducted a series of experiments to test how repeated exposure shapes emotional response, even when there's no conscious awareness of the exposure itself. In one study, participants were shown a series of nonsense words, invented terms like Cadillac, Werbus, or Nansima. Some words appeared only once. Others were shown 5, 10, or 25 times. Afterward, participants were asked to rate how good or pleasant each word seemed. The results were consistent. The more frequently a word had been shown, the more positively it was rated. There was no context, no definition, no meaning, just exposure, and it created preference. In another variation, Sejong used foreign language characters, Chinese symbols, unfamiliar to the participants. Again, the symbols shown more frequently were judged more favorably, and it didn't stop at words or symbols. Sejong expanded the research to faces. When participants were shown unfamiliar human faces, the ones seen more often, even for fractions of a second, were rated as more likable, more trustworthy, and more attractive. The participants couldn't explain why. They weren't aware of the manipulation, but their emotional responses shifted silently in favor of familiarity. This effect has since been replicated across hundreds of studies. It works with images, sounds, patterns, objects, even ideas. The key variable isn't quality, it's repetition, which raises uncomfortable questions. How many of your preferences, from brands to people, were created by accidental exposure? How many things do you like, trust, or defend because they're simply familiar? This has massive implications. In advertising, companies flood you with brand names, logos, and jingles, not to persuade you logically, but to build emotional familiarity. In politics, repeated slogans and faces, even if irritating, become more accepted over time. In relationships, people report falling for coworkers, classmates, or neighbors, not because of compatibility, but because of proximity and repeated exposure. The human brain mistakes familiarity for safety. It equates repetition with trust, even when there's no evidence for either. This is why propaganda works, why people cling to dangerous ideologies, why toxic patterns feel comforting. Because the brain isn't filtering for truth, it's tracking exposure. And the more often something appears, the more deeply it embeds. Not because it deserves to, but because it's already there. Zejong's research stripped away the illusion of rational preference. It showed that you don't need logic, quality, or truth to gain loyalty. You just need presence, time, repetition. What's repeated becomes accepted. What's familiar becomes safe, and what's safe becomes loved, even if it never earned it. Balance theory. Can a triangle explain your emotions, your alliances, and your hatred? Psychologists tested that, and what they found is disturbingly accurate. Balance theory was introduced by Fritz Heider in the 1940s to explain how people maintain psychological consistency in their relationships and beliefs. The core idea is simple. Humans are uncomfortable when their attitudes, relationships, or opinions conflict, especially in three-person systems. Heider proposed that our minds instinctively seek balance in these triads. For example, you like your friend likes a band, but you hate the band. This creates imbalance. To reduce discomfort, you're likely to either change your view of the band, downgrade your opinion of the friend, or convince yourself your dislike isn't serious. It's not logical, it's emotional equilibrium. But Heider's theory didn't just stay in theory. Researchers began testing how this invisible pressure worked in practice. One of the clearest experimental tests came in 1962, when Abelson and Rosenberg designed a controlled study to observe how people react when their beliefs and social preferences collide, especially within interpersonal triads. The experiment was structured using mock profiles and carefully manipulated relationships. Participants were told they would be evaluating people based on limited information. They were given profiles containing opinions, hobbies, and beliefs, including stances on political topics, personal preferences, and social issues. Critically, each participant was presented with 3 characters at a time, forming a psychological triangle. The participant themselves, person A, someone they liked, and person B, whose attributes varied. The key manipulation was this. In some cases, person A liked person B, but person B held views that the participant disliked, or even found morally wrong. This created imbalance. You like person A likes person B. but you dislike person B. The researchers then observed how participants responded, not through direct questioning, but by watching which judgments shifted after the imbalance was introduced. Did they downgrade person A? Did they soften toward person B? Did they reinterpret person B's wrong opinions as less extreme? In multiple trials, the pattern was clear and repeatable. Participants showed a strong tendency to adjust their evaluations in ways that restored balance. Many softened their stance toward the disliked person B, simply because someone they liked approved of them. Others revised how much they liked person A, but usually only when person B's views were too extreme to ignore. In some cases, they altered the severity of their own original belief to reduce tension, telling themselves, maybe I overreacted, even when no new information was added. What disturbed researchers most was how automatic these adjustments were. Participants didn't appear aware they were bending their views. They believed they were acting objectively. But the real driver was hidden, the pressure to reduce mental friction inside the triad. The findings confirmed Haider's theory. People don't just hold opinions, they balance them around social connections. Disagreement is uncomfortable, but conflicting loyalties are worse. And when loyalty and logic clash, logic is usually the first to break. This helps explain why people defend public figures who betray their stated values, why friend groups fracture when someone introduces a polarizing opinion, why family members rewrite political stances to preserve unity, and why in cults or authoritarian systems controlling a few social nodes can ripple belief changes through an entire group. Without coercion, people want harmony, but what balance theory shows is that they want emotional harmony, even at the cost of accuracy. Abelson and Rosenberg's experiment made something invisible visible. The structure of belief is not linear, it's geometric. Triangular tensions drive shifts in loyalty, opinion, and even morality. You might think you hate someone's ideas, but if someone you trust approves of them, your mind will look for an excuse to agree. Not because the idea changed, but because the triangle needed to close. Crutchfield Situation. What happens when you take peer pressure and make it completely silent? Most people know about Asch's conformity study, standing in a room, listening as everyone gives the wrong answer out loud. But what happens when the pressure isn't spoken? When there's no group staring at you? Just silent consensus, and the illusion of everyone agreeing. That's what psychologist Richard Crutchfield wanted to test in 1955. He designed a new method for studying conformity, one that eliminated the face-to-face interaction, the direct pressure, and the possibility of real-time influence. The subjects would be alone in a room, and yet, most of them still gave in. The experiment took place in a lab equipped with individual cubicles. Each participant was seated alone, surrounded by partitions. They couldn't see or speak to the others, only interact through a panel of switches and indicator lights. They were told they were part of a group judgment study, and that everyone would be responding simultaneously, each in their own cubicle. Each person would see the group's responses light up on a panel, and then make their own choice. But the setup was fake. The other lights, supposedly representing other participants' answers, were controlled by the experimenter. This was the innovation. It created the illusion of group consensus, without a group. No social pressure, no fear of judgment, no audience, just lights on a panel, and a decision to make. The tasks were similar to Asch's, identifying shapes, comparing lengths, basic perceptual questions, where the answer was usually obvious. Crutchfield observed that when the group unanimously gave incorrect answers, the real participant, sitting alone, would often follow them. Conformity rates ranged from 30% to 50% depending on the question type and clarity, even without any people in the room, even when the correct answer was visually obvious. Participants were later debriefed. Many expressed confusion, unease, or embarrassment. Some said they had doubted their own eyes. Others claimed they didn't want to be the only one who disagreed, even though no one could see their answers. The pressure to conform had become internalized. Crutchfield's method had several key advantages over Asch's. It allowed multiple participants to be tested simultaneously. It prevented groupthink due to live interaction. Everything was pre-programmed. It isolated the cognitive side of conformity. proving that just the idea of a group was enough to sway someone's judgment, and it worked. Participants consistently gave wrong answers just because they believed others had done the same. No crowd, no judgment, just imagined consensus. The implications are widespread. People online conform to the tone or direction of a conversation thread just because of visible upvotes or repeated comments. In surveys, polling and rating systems, early responses can shape the rest, even when users are anonymous. In organizational settings, people align with a decision if they think it's already been accepted by others, even if no one explicitly pressured them. Crutchfield showed that physical presence isn't required for conformity. Just the belief that others agree, even if unseen, can cause people to doubt themselves. And that's what makes this study so unsettling. The enemy isn't peer pressure, it's the expectation of it. You don't need anyone watching, you just need to believe they're out there, and that belief alone is enough to make you wrong on purpose. Group polarization. What happens when people with similar opinions talk things through and end up with more extreme views than they started with? In 1961, psychologist James Stoner set out to test how group discussions influence decision-making, especially in situations involving risk. At the time, the common assumption was that when people talk in groups, their opinions balance out. That extremes soften. That consensus means moderation. Stoner suspected otherwise. To find out, he designed an experiment using a series of controlled decision-making dilemmas, presented to participants in two phases. First, as individuals, and then as part of a group discussion. Here's how the experiment worked. Participants were given written descriptions of fictional people facing difficult life decisions. The scenarios were intentionally structured to include a clear trade-off between caution and risk. One example, a man named Mr. Jones has a stable job with a guaranteed pension, but he's been offered a position at a new startup. The new job could make him rich, but it might also fail. At what minimum chance of success should Mr. Jones take the risk and leave his current job? Each participant first made their private decision, writing down the lowest probability of success where they'd still recommend the risky move. This part was done completely alone. No interaction, no social pressure. Then, participants were placed into small discussion groups, usually 4 to 6 people, and asked to reach a group decision on the same exact scenario. They discussed, debated, and eventually settled on a shared answer. The results were clear. In case after case, the group decision was more extreme than the average of the individual's original answers. If most people leaned toward taking the risk, the group decision pushed further, recommending the risk even with a much lower chance of success. If the group leaned toward caution, they became more conservative after discussion. Stoner repeated the experiment with multiple dilemmas. A woman deciding whether to have a risky surgery with uncertain outcomes. A company weighing whether to invest in a high-stakes product launch. Scenarios involving moral risk, career sacrifice, and financial gambling. The pattern held every time. Discussion didn't average the responses, it amplified them. Groups weren't diluting opinions, they were sharpening them. This phenomenon was later named group polarization, and it directly challenged the idea that discussion naturally leads to compromise. Since Stoner's original study, group polarization has been observed in many forms: political, moral, economic. But those broader patterns don't change the core mechanism. When people with similar leanings talk, they often push each other further toward that direction without realizing it. That's what Stoner's experiment proved. You don't need propaganda, peer pressure, or manipulation, just agreement, repeated, reinforced, and slightly escalated. The Hofling Hospital Study. How far will people go when told to break the rules by someone they've never even met? In this study, the answer was almost all the way. In 1966, psychiatrist Charles Hofling ran one of the most quietly horrifying obedience studies in medical history. There were no shouting sergeants, no staged emergencies, no fake shocks or buzzing lights. Just a phone call and a calm voice that said, "Give the patient a drug." The nurse on the other end was faced with 3 facts. The drug was unauthorized, the dosage was clearly unsafe, and the doctor giving the order was a stranger, someone they had never met. This wasn't theater. It was a real hospital. The nurses were on duty. The patients were real people. And what happened next exposed just how deep obedience to authority runs in modern systems. Seers. Here's how the study worked. Hofling's team contacted 22 nurses working night shifts at a hospital in the United States. Each nurse was called individually during their actual work hours, when their supervising physicians were not present. On the phone, a voice identified himself as Dr. Smith, a fictional doctor not affiliated with the hospital. He gave the nurse a patient's name and instructed her to administer a drug called Astratin, a fictional medication created for the study. The instructions were precise. Inject 20 milligrams of Astratin immediately. Prepare the patient without delay. The doctor would sign the formal authorization papers when he arrived. Here's what made this request clearly illegitimate. First, hospital policy. Nurses were not allowed to give any medication without a signed order from a doctor. Second, the dosage. The label on the bottle said 10 milligrams max. But the doctor on the phone ordered twice that amount, 20 milligrams. Third, the doctor himself. The nurse had never met him. He wasn't on record. He was just a voice on the phone. And fourth, the drug, Astratin, wasn't listed anywhere in the hospital's official registry. It was completely unfamiliar. Under hospital regulations and standard training, the nurse should have refused immediately and reported the incident. But almost none of them did. 21 out of 22 nurses began preparing the injection. They were stopped only moments before administering the drug, just in time to prevent a potential overdose. Some had already retrieved the vial. Others had entered the patient's file. A few were walking toward the patient's room with the syringe ready. Afterward, when interviewed, many nurses admitted that they knew the request felt wrong, but they complied anyway. Why? They cited the authority of the doctor, even though he was only a voice on the phone. They said they didn't want to question a superior. Some believed the doctor would take responsibility, so they wouldn't be blamed. And perhaps most telling, several nurses said they would not have believed this could happen if they hadn't gone through it themselves. Hofling's team ran a control condition beforehand. They asked a group of nurses and doctors what they would do in this exact situation. Almost all predicted that nurses would refuse the order. The reality was the opposite. The study showed that medical professionals, trained, licensed, and experienced, would break clear safety protocols based solely on verbal authority. No threats, no pressure, just a confident voice and an assumption of hierarchy. This wasn't just about hospitals, it was about systems. It revealed that in structured institutions, even ones built around patient safety, obedience can override judgment. You don't need coercion, you just need someone to say, "I'm the doctor, do it." The Bickman uniform study. If a stranger told you what to do on the street, would you obey? What if he wore a uniform? In 1974, psychologist Leonard Bickman wanted to test something that had never been measured in real life with real people. We know that people obey authority in labs. But what about on the street, in public, when the person giving orders is just a man standing beside you? Bickman suspected that it wasn't what people said that mattered. It was what they looked like when they said it. So he ran an experiment to see how clothing alone could influence obedience. The study took place in Brooklyn, New York. Real sidewalks, real pedestrians, real moments. Bickman and his team used 3 different outfits. A civilian outfit, just regular street clothes. A milkman's uniform, white jacket, white pants, cap, and a security guard's uniform. Dark slacks, jacket, badge, name tag, and a police-style cap. Each actor stood in public places, near parking meters, benches, or crosswalks, and gave unsuspecting pedestrians simple commands. The orders were short, direct, and intentionally meaningless. Pick up that bag. Stand on the other side of that sign. Give that person a dime for the parking meter. None of these tasks had any legal or moral weight. They weren't emergencies. There was no real consequence for saying no. But the results were undeniable. Obedience rates vary dramatically, based on nothing but clothing. Let's break it down for spoken clarity. When the actor wore regular street clothes, only about 30% of people obeyed. Dressed as a milkman, it stayed about the same, around 33%. But in a security guard uniform, obedience jumped to 89%. That's right, nearly 9 out of 10 people did what they were told, with no context, no reason, no questions, just because the man looked like someone with authority, even when the request made no sense, even when it involved giving money to a stranger. Bickman ran additional variations. Sometimes, the actor walked away immediately after giving the command. Even then, people followed through, with no one watching. It wasn't fear of being caught. It wasn't social pressure. It was internalized authority, triggered by appearance alone. And when surveyed afterward, many participants couldn't explain why they obeyed. Some didn't even remember questioning it. The uniform had bypassed their decision-making process. What made this study so disturbing wasn't how much people obeyed. It was how little it took to make them obey. There was no badge number, no ID, no background, just a cap, a name tag, and a voice that sounded official. And that was enough. Bickman's study didn't rely on fear, reward, or pressure. It showed how the visual cue of authority, a simple costume, can cause ordinary people to act against their own instincts. This same dynamic shows up in scams, where con artists wear uniforms to gain trust, in social hierarchies, where people defer to those who look the part, and in far darker histories, where obedience to uniformed figures has led to real harm. The uniform didn't give the man power, it gave the illusion of power, and for most people, that was enough. Change blindness studies. If someone swapped places with another person mid-conversation, would you notice? In this experiment, most people didn't. In 1998, psychologists Daniel Simons and Daniel Levin took the study of perception even further. Their earlier experiment, the invisible gorilla, proved we could miss the absurd when focused on a task. But what if the task was just looking at someone's face? No distractions, no counting, no tricks, just talking to another person, and still not noticing when that person is suddenly replaced by someone else. This is called change blindness, the failure to notice visual changes in a scene, even when they happen right in front of your eyes. To test it, Simons and Levin created a field experiment disguised as a casual conversation. Here's how it worked. A researcher approached a random pedestrian on a college campus and asked for directions, something ordinary, like how to find a library or a building nearby. The person giving directions usually stopped and engaged politely. But partway through the conversation, something unexpected happened. Two people walked directly between the researcher and the pedestrian, carrying a large wooden door. As the door passed through and blocked the view for just a second, the original researcher stepped away, and a completely different person, different height, different build, different voice, took his place and continued the conversation. The switch took about 2 seconds. Then the new person simply kept talking, finishing the original question, pretending nothing had happened. What they found was astonishing. Out of 15 people approached in this way, only 7 noticed the switch. That means more than half continued the conversation without realizing the person in front of them had changed completely. Even when the two actors had noticeable differences, different shirts, different hairstyles, or facial features, people still didn't catch it. And this wasn't because they weren't paying attention. These were face-to-face, eye-level conversations. No multitasking, no distractions. Just a visual failure, triggered by a brief interruption. This wasn't a one-time event. In other versions of the study, researchers changed smaller visual elements in photos or videos, like the color of a curtain, the number of objects on a table, or even entire buildings in the background. Participants often failed to notice these changes, even when looking directly at them. The pattern held. If a brief visual disruption happened, like a flicker, a cut, or a blink, people assumed the scene was stable. Their brain filled in the gap. The change was effectively erased from awareness. The most disturbing part is this. Your brain creates the illusion of a stable visual world. But in truth, you're only seeing fragments. And if something changes during a gap, you might never know it changed at all. This has serious implications. Eyewitnesses can be completely confident about what they saw, even if what they saw changed halfway through. In security footage analysis, key details can go unnoticed when attention shifts. In everyday life, you can interact with your surroundings confidently, and still be wrong about what's actually there. Change blindness doesn't mean you're distracted. It means your brain is filling in blanks it never noticed were empty. In Simons and Levin's experiment, people looked another human in the eyes, spoke to them directly, and still didn't notice when that human was swapped for a stranger. If your eyes can't even lock onto a face without error, what else have you already missed? Capgras Delusion. What happens when someone looks at their mother and becomes convinced she's an identical fake? Not someone wearing a disguise, not someone who looks similar, but someone who is absolutely identical, same face, same voice, same habits, and yet completely wrong. This is the reality of a rare and deeply disturbing psychiatric condition called Capgras Delusion, named after French psychiatrist Joseph Capgras, who first described it in 1923. He documented the case of a woman who believed her husband had been replaced by a series of doubles. Every time she saw him, she was sure it wasn't really him, just someone who looked exactly like him. The stranger would act the same, speak the same, remember things only her husband would know, but her mind rejected him. He looks like my husband, but I know he's not. This wasn't paranoia, it wasn't hallucination, it was something more specific, a break between recognition and emotion. To understand Capgras Delusion, we need to understand what recognition actually means. When you see someone you know, say, your best friend, your brain does two things at once. It visually recognizes their face. It activates an emotional response. That's someone familiar, someone I trust. These two systems, facial recognition and emotional familiarity, usually work together. But in Capgras Delusion, something breaks. The visual system is intact. Patients can describe the face in perfect detail. They can say, yes, this looks exactly like my father, but the emotional connection doesn't activate. There's no feeling of familiarity, and so the brain comes to a terrifying conclusion. If this looks like someone I know, but it doesn't feel like them, it must be a fake. One of the most widely studied cases came from neurologist Vilayan Noor Ramachandran. He worked with a man who had suffered a traumatic brain injury. After recovering physically, the man began reporting a strange belief. My parents look like my parents, but they're not my parents. He wasn't confused. He wasn't angry. He was calm and absolutely certain. He said his real parents had been replaced with imposters who were copying them. Ramachandran ran a series of tests. The patient could name photographs of his parents with no trouble. He passed facial recognition tasks easily. But when researchers measured his skin conductance, a way to track emotional arousal, there was no response when he looked at his parents. There was zero emotional recognition. His visual brain said, this is someone you know, but his emotional brain said, this is a stranger. That internal contradiction had to be resolved. So the brain created a story to explain it. They must be imposters, not just wrong, but identical copies placed there for unknown, sometimes sinister, reasons. Capgras cases often involve close family members, parents, children, spouses, but the delusion can extend to pets, familiar locations, even one's own reflection. It's not psychosis in the traditional sense. Patients don't always hear voices or lose grip on reality in general. Often, they function normally, except for the belief that someone close to them has been swapped with a double. Some patients develop elaborate theories that government agents are involved, that robots or actors have replaced their loved ones, that they are trapped in a simulation or staged environment. And yet, their vision, hearing, and memory all check out. What's broken is the feeling of familiarity. Neurologically, Capgras has been linked to damage in the connection between the fusiform face area, which processes facial identity, and the amygdala, which handles emotional response. When this connection is severed or disrupted, the brain sees the face, but doesn't feel it. And that absence creates terror, not because of what they see, but because of what they don't feel. Capgras delusion is rare, but its implications are widespread. It shows that recognition is not just visual, it is emotional, and when that emotional wiring is severed, even your own mother can feel like a stranger wearing a perfect mask. If your brain can do that with someone you've known your entire life, what else can it make you forget? The rubber hand illusion. What if you could feel touch on a hand that isn't yours? What if, in less than a minute, your brain believed a piece of plastic was part of your body? This is not science fiction, it's a real experiment, and it works on almost everyone. In 1998, psychologists Matthew Botvinnik and Jonathan Cohen designed a test that exposed a strange, terrifying truth. Your sense of what is you, even your own body, can be hacked with nothing but a glove, a brush, and a rubber hand. Let's walk through the experiment step by step. A participant is seated at a table. Their left hand is placed flat on the surface, but hidden from view behind a vertical screen or box. Just a few inches away, in full view, sits a rubber hand, a realistic fake hand positioned in the same orientation as the hidden real one. So from the participant's perspective, they're looking down and seeing a hand in the right place, even though they know it's fake. Now the experimenter takes two identical paintbrushes. They begin to stroke the real hand and the rubber hand at the same time, in the same direction, at the same rhythm. A gentle sweep across the knuckles, a tap on the fingertips, circular motions on the back of the hand. To the participant, it looks like the rubber hand is being touched, and it feels like their hand is being touched at exactly the same moment. And then, something strange starts to happen. Within 30 to 60 seconds, most participants begin to feel that the rubber hand is their real hand. Some feel warmth, some feel tingling, some flinch if the rubber hand is threatened, pulling back or gasping when a hammer or needle is brought near. In some cases, participants report ownership of the rubber hand, saying, "It feels like that's my hand. I know it's fake, but it feels real. It's like my brain has moved." This phenomenon is called the rubber hand illusion. It reveals how your brain builds body ownership, not by detecting your limbs directly, but by combining visual and tactile information. When the visual input, seeing the rubber hand touched, and the tactile input, feeling your own hand touched, are perfectly synchronized, the brain fuses them. It decides, that must be my hand. I see it being touched, and I feel the touch. The brain prioritizes coherence over truth. It wants to create a unified sense of self, even if it means adopting a body part that isn't yours. The illusion has been tested in many variations. If the strokes are not synchronized, the effect doesn't happen. If the rubber hand is placed at a strange angle or too far away, the illusion breaks down. If the real hand is stroked alone, while the rubber hand remains untouched, there's no ownership transfer. But when the conditions are just right, timing, location, rhythm, the brain accepts the lie. In one study, researchers even placed two rubber hands on the table, one on each side, and managed to convince participants that both fake hands belonged to them. In another version, participants began to disown their real hand, reporting numbness, detachment, or feeling like it didn't belong anymore. The implications go far beyond a parlor trick. This illusion has been used to explore phantom limb syndrome in amputees, how the brain can misattribute ownership to limbs that are no longer there. Prosthetics research, helping artificial limbs feel more real to patients, and even virtual reality, where people can feel ownership over avatars that look nothing like them, even non-human bodies. It also reveals something deeper and darker. Your brain doesn't care what's real. It cares what's believable, what fits the incoming signals. And when those signals line up, you will feel something that isn't yours, as if it was always part of you. Your body, your self-image, your identity. They're not fixed. They're flexible, reconstructible, and sometimes replaceable. All it takes is the right illusion, and your mind will do the rest. Body transfer illusions. In a previous experiment, researchers made people feel ownership over a fake rubber hand. It was strange, unsettling, but it was just a hand. Now imagine taking that illusion further, not just to a limb, but to an entire body. Not in a dream, not in a hallucination, but in a controlled scientific experiment, where your mind is slowly convinced that someone else's body is yours. These are called body transfer illusions, and once they begin, your brain stops asking questions. It sees from the eyes of a stranger and decides, this is me now. These illusions don't just fool your senses, They make you feel like you've become someone else, even when your real body is still sitting in a chair. One of the most striking demonstrations came from neuroscientist Henrik Ehrson in 2007. The experiment was simple in design, but profound in effect. Subjects wore a virtual reality headset, one that showed them a video feed from a camera placed behind a mannequin. The camera was positioned right where the mannequin's eyes would be. So when participants put on the headset, they didn't see their own body, they saw the mannequin's body from a first-person perspective. In other words, they saw what the mannequin would see. Now came the trick. The experimenter simultaneously stroked the participant's real chest, out of sight, and stroked the chest of the mannequin, visible in the video feed. The timing was perfectly synchronized. Each touch, felt and seen at the same time, in the same location. After just a few moments, participants began to feel that the mannequin's body was their own. Many said things like, "It feels like I'm over there. I know this isn't me, but it feels like my body. It's like myself has moved." Some participants even flinched or jerked away when the mannequin was threatened, like when the researcher brought a knife or hammer near its chest. Their brains registered danger, not to the mannequin, but to them. This illusion isn't limited to mannequins. In 2010, a team led by Valeria Petkova conducted a similar experiment, this time using 2 human participants. The subject wore a VR headset and saw from the perspective of another person sitting across from them. Again, synchronized touches were applied to both bodies at the same time: chest, arms, legs. Very quickly, the subject began to feel as if they were inhabiting the other person's body. When asked to point to themselves, many participants pointed not to their real body, but to the other person across the room. The illusion had overwritten their sense of location, ownership, and identity. The mechanics behind this are straightforward and chilling. Your brain builds your sense of body ownership by combining visual perspective, where your eyes are located, tactile input, what you feel, motor feedback, what you move. If you mess with those inputs, especially synchronizing visual and tactile signals in a new body, your brain reassigns ownership. It says, "This must be my body. I can see from its eyes. I feel its touch. I must be here." This isn't just illusion. It's a full-body identity transplant, achieved in less than 60 seconds. Researchers have used body transfer to test empathy. Participants placed in the body of another race or gender often show reduced bias afterward. Phobia treatments. People with fear of spiders feel calmer when inside a fearless avatar. Pain studies. Some patients report reduced pain when transferred into a different visual body. Virtual embodiment. In VR, you can become a child, a giant, or even a non-human form. And your brain adjusts accordingly, but it also raises something darker. If your sense of self can be transferred so easily, how do you know your current body is you? Your identity, your presence, is not rooted in muscle or skin. It's just a signal, built from sight and sensation, and that signal can be rerouted anywhere. Loftus's misinformation effect. What if a single sentence could change your memory, not just confuse it, but actually rewrite it? That's what Elizabeth Loftus discovered. We often think of memory like a file. You store it, then later you retrieve it. The details might fade, but the core remains intact. But Loftus showed something far more unsettling. Memory is not a file. It's a reconstruction, and if you're given the wrong piece while reconstructing, you'll build the wrong memory and believe it completely. In the mid-1970s, Elizabeth Loftus, a cognitive psychologist at the University of Washington, began running experiments that tested just how fragile human memory really was. One of her most famous studies used something very simple, a video of a car crash. Here's how it was structured. Participants were shown short clips of 2 cars colliding at an intersection. There were no surprises, no hidden tricks, just cars approaching, making contact, and stopping. After the video, participants were asked a simple question: how fast were the cars going when they dashed each other? But there was a twist. The blank wasn't always filled with the same verb. Some people heard when they hit each other. Others heard when they smashed into each other, collided with each other, bumped, contacted. That's all that changed. One word. The video stayed the same, but when Loftus analyzed the responses, the results were clear. Participants who heard smashed estimated significantly higher speeds, sometimes by as much as 10-15 miles per hour. Those who heard contacted gave the lowest estimates. The language reshaped how fast they believed the cars were moving, but it didn't stop there. A week later, Loftus called participants back and asked a follow-up question. Did you see any broken glass? There had been no broken glass in the video. None. But those who'd heard the word smashed were more than twice as likely to say yes. One word, used just once, had implanted a false memory, not a guess, not a distortion. A new belief, stitched into the original experience. This became known as the Misinformation Effect, the tendency for post-event information to interfere with and alter the original memory. Loftus repeated the experiment with different stimuli: a purse snatching, a stop sign versus a yield sign, a robbery involving a screwdriver that became a hammer. A man with brown hair suddenly remembered as blonde. The pattern was always the same. You insert a false detail, the memory absorbs it, and the person's confidence stays high, even though the memory is wrong. And that last part is key. Even when memories are false, people believe them completely. They'll argue, swear by it, pass lie detector tests, cry over events that never happened, not because they're lying, but because their brain wrote the wrong story and then believed it. The implications are massive. Eyewitness testimony becomes dangerously unreliable. Police questioning techniques can unintentionally plant false memories. Therapy sessions, if handled poorly, can produce emotional memories of events that never occurred. In one study, Loftus even convinced participants that they had once been lost in a shopping mall as a child, an event that never happened. Many of them recalled it in vivid, emotional detail. We'll come back to that experiment shortly, and when you hear how it worked, it may change the way you trust your own past. We like to believe memory is sacred, that what we remember, especially emotionally, must be true. But Loftus proved a chilling alternative. Memory is a story you keep editing without realizing it, and all it takes is the wrong word, spoken at the right time, to make you remember something that never happened at all. Lost in the Mall study. How easy is it to convince someone that something happened in their childhood when it never happened at all? In 1995, Elizabeth Loftus and her graduate student, Jacqueline Pickrell, decided to test a question few psychologists had dared to ask directly. Can you implant a completely false memory? Not a detail, not a distortion, but an entire event. Not a memory of a blurry accident or a mistaken detail, but something emotionally vivid, personally meaningful, and entirely fictional. And could that memory then be recalled in detail as if it were real? Here's how the study worked. Step by step, Loftus and Pickrell recruited 24 participants, all of whom had close family members, usually parents or older siblings, who could assist behind the scenes. Each participant was told they were part of a study on childhood memories. They would be asked to read descriptions of 4 events that supposedly happened to them between the ages of 4 and 6. The descriptions were said to come from interviews with family members, things that really happened. But only 3 of the stories were true. The 4th was entirely fabricated, and this false one was always the same. You got lost in a shopping mall as a young child. In the story, the child was said to have wandered away from their family during a visit to a large mall. They panicked, they cried, a kind elderly person helped them, and eventually, they were reunited with their family, who were understandably upset. Here's the disturbing part. This memory was completely invented. The family confirmed it never happened, but it was presented alongside real memories, with the same level of detail and tone. Participants were asked to read all 4 memories and write down everything they could recall about each one. Then they were brought back for 2 follow-up interviews, spaced about a week apart, and asked again to recall more details. By the 2nd or 3rd session, something strange began to happen. About 1/3 of participants began to remember the mall event. They didn't just recognize the story, they added new details that weren't in the original fake description. One said he remembered the flannel shirt the elderly man wore. Another described looking up and seeing a fountain. One participant cried during the interview, recalling the panic of being alone. Others insisted they had told their parents about it before. They were not pretending. They believed it. Some participants who initially said, "I don't remember this," later revised themselves and began defending the memory as real. When they were finally told the mall story was fake, many were shocked. Some laughed nervously. Others seemed uncomfortable, even embarrassed. A few resisted the debriefing, saying things like, "Well, maybe it did happen. My mom just forgot." Even with hard evidence that it was fictional, the memory had cemented. What made this study so disturbing is how ordinary the event was. It wasn't traumatic. It wasn't bizarre. It was plausible, the kind of thing that could easily have happened to any child. That's what made it so dangerous, because it meant that memory isn't just vulnerable to high-stress trauma, but to casual suggestion, especially when it's wrapped in emotion, family, and repetition. This study later became a foundation for broader debates in psychology, law, and therapy. If false memories can be implanted so easily under controlled conditions, then how many people are living with fabricated pasts, believing in events that were never real? It raised difficult questions about recovered memories, eyewitness testimony, and the reliability of our own personal histories. Loftus had proven something chilling. Your brain doesn't just rewrite what you saw, it can create a childhood you never lived. The trolley problem. You're standing beside a railway track. A trolley is speeding toward 5 workers. You can't warn them, you can't stop the train, but you can pull a lever and redirect the trolley to another track, where only one person stands. That's the thought experiment. The famous trolley problem. You've probably heard it. It's discussed in ethics classes, online debates, and late-night conversations. But what you probably haven't heard is this. Psychologists have actually tested it in labs, in virtual reality, and in high-pressure simulations. They've watched people make these choices, and the results are deeply unsettling. The original trolley problem was introduced in the 1960s by British philosopher Philippa Foot, and later expanded by Judith Jarvis Thomson. Its purpose was to explore the tension between 2 moral frameworks: utilitarianism, the idea that the best action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number; deontology, the idea that some actions are morally wrong, even if they lead to better outcomes. So, is it morally acceptable to kill 1 person to save 5? In surveys, most people say yes, they'd pull the lever. But what happens when the scenario isn't just hypothetical? The earliest major real-world version came from a team at the University of Michigan in 2006. Led by Dr. Fiery Cushman, they designed an immersive scenario using computer-based simulations with 480 participants across multiple conditions. Each participant saw an animated trolley moving toward 5 people stuck on a track. They were told, if you do nothing, the 5 will be killed. If you press a button, the trolley will switch tracks and kill 1 person instead. In this version, where the action was impersonal and mechanical, 89% of participants chose to act. They pushed the button. They sacrificed 1 to save 5. But the researchers didn't stop there. They ran a second condition, identical in stakes, but personal in action. Now, instead of pressing a button, participants were told, you are standing on a footbridge. A large man is beside you. If you push him onto the track, his body will stop the trolley, saving the 5. In this variation, only 31% of participants said they would push him, and when asked how confident they were, most hesitated. Some reported physical discomfort. Several openly admitted they'd freeze in a real situation. The difference between these 2 setups is known as the personal versus personal moral dilemma. In the impersonal case, you flip a switch. The act is indirect. In the personal case, you touch the person, you become the cause, and your emotional response takes over. To test that even further, neuroscientists, like Joshua Green at Harvard, scanned participants' brains using fMRI machines while they made these decisions. When participants considered pulling the lever, their prefrontal cortex lit up, the area responsible for reasoning and cost-benefit analysis. But when asked to imagine pushing a man, it was the amygdala and anterior cingulate cortex, regions associated with emotion, pain, and empathy, that became highly active. The logical part of the brain knew the numbers, but the emotional system couldn't do it. Now comes the most intense version, in virtual reality. In 2012, a team led by Dr. Jean-François Bonnefond and colleagues created a fully immersive VR simulation of the trolley problem. Participants wore a headset and stood inside a virtual switch station. They could hear the trolleys rumble, see 5 workers on one track, 1 worker on the other. They had 7 seconds to reach forward and pull the lever. In total, 98 participants were tested. When inside VR, where sounds, visuals, and motion cues made the situation feel real, 85% of participants pulled the lever to sacrifice 1 and save 5. But researchers also monitored sweat levels, heart rate, and reaction times. They found that people who hesitated, even by 1 or 2 seconds, showed elevated skin conductance. Their bodies were physically reacting to the moral weight of the decision. Some participants began breathing harder. One cried during debriefing. Several asked if the people were real, even after being told they were not. So why does this matter? Because real-world decisions often look like the trolley problem, but in messier, higher-stakes situations. Take autonomous vehicles. In 2018, MIT's Moral Machine project surveyed over 2 million people across 233 countries. They were shown trolley-style dilemmas for self-driving cars. Should the car hit a jaywalking pedestrian? Should it swerve and kill the passenger to save a group on the road? Should it prioritize children over adults? The data showed that moral preferences varied dramatically by culture. In Western countries, people often saved more lives, even if it meant killing a pedestrian. In Eastern countries, they prioritized protecting the elderly or following the law. Some countries favored young over old. Others valued passenger safety above all. What's moral in one place is monstrous in another. And when machines have to make that choice, someone has to program the ethics. That person might be sitting in a lab with a keyboard, deciding who dies. The Knobe Effect. In 2003, psychologist and philosopher Joshua Knobe ran a real-world psychology experiment at Yale University. He wanted to know, does moral judgment influence how we decide whether someone acted on purpose? In other words, can the morality of the outcome actually distort how we judge a person's intention, even when their motivation doesn't change? So Knobe designed a controlled experiment. The setup was simple. The results were deeply unsettling. Participants, mostly university students, were randomly assigned to read one of 2 nearly identical stories. Each story involved a corporate executive deciding to launch a new company program. They were told, the vice president is launching a new initiative to increase profits. In the process, it will also affect the environment. Here's where the experiment splits. For Group A, the side effect is negative. He is told the program will harm the environment. The vice president replies, I don't care about the environment, I just want to make money. The program is approved. The environment is damaged. Participants were then asked, did the vice president harm the environment intentionally? 82% said yes. Not only did they judge the outcome as bad, they judged the intent as deliberate. Now for Group B, the only difference was the outcome. He is told the program will help the environment. He again says, I don't care about the environment. I just want to make money. The program is approved. The environment improves. Same motive, same indifference, different side effect. Now the question, did the vice president help the environment intentionally? Only 23% said yes. So, with identical motives, one harmful result was seen as intentional, but one helpful result was not. The experiment showed a consistent asymmetry. When a bad side effect occurred, participants judged it as intentional. When a good side effect occurred, they judged it as unintentional. This became known as the Knobe Effect, or the side effect effect. It showed that people don't just evaluate intention based on logic or evidence, they evaluate it through moral emotion. If the result feels wrong, we assume the actor meant it. Knobe repeated the design across multiple contexts, with carefully controlled variables. Let's walk through a few of them. In one study, participants read, a commander orders a bombing mission. He's told it will destroy an enemy weapons depot, but also kill nearby civilians. He replies, "I don't care about the civilians. I just want to win the war." The mission proceeds. The civilians are killed. Asked if the commander intentionally harmed the civilians, over 70% said yes. Now flip it. Same mission. But this time, the bombing rescues hostages held nearby. The commander still says, "I don't care, I just want to win the war." Now, fewer than 30% say he intentionally helped the civilians. So, same motive, same indifference. But the moral weight of the outcome changes how people assign intent. Another version involved a medical scenario. Participants read, a doctor prescribes a drug to treat a life-threatening infection. She's told it will likely cause hair loss as a side effect. She replies, "That's not my concern. I just want to cure the patient." The patient recovers. Their hair falls out. Asked if the hair loss was caused intentionally, most participants said yes. In the alternate version, the same drug causes enhanced memory. Same response from the doctor, "I don't care, I just want them cured." This time, most participants said the benefit was not intentional. Again, the morality of the side effect flips the perception of intent. These experiments weren't one-offs. They've been replicated across age groups, cultures, and even in children. The structure stays the same. Two nearly identical conditions, same motive, morally different outcomes. Judgment of intention flips. This has become one of the most widely studied phenomena in moral psychology. The Knobe Effect reveals something uncomfortable, how a judgment of what someone meant to do is not based on what they actually wanted. It's based on how we feel about what happened. It's backwards logic. We see a bad result. We feel outrage, and then we backfill. They must have meant to do it. When the result is good, we forgive. We minimize. We say, "That was just luck." In a courtroom, this could change lives. In politics, it could change reputations. In everyday life, it means we might be blaming people for things they never intended, and we don't even realize we're doing it. Free choice paradigm. Imagine you're choosing between two items. You don't love either one, but you have to pick. You choose one. It's done. A few minutes later, you're asked to rank them again, and suddenly, you now like your choice more than you did before. The one you rejected, you now dislike it more than before. Nothing about the options has changed. What changed was you. This is what psychologists call the free choice paradigm, a method that reveals how the human mind quietly edits our beliefs after we make a decision, not because of evidence, not because of facts, but because of a need to feel right. The first known free choice paradigm experiment was conducted in 1956 by psychologist Jack Brem at the University of Minnesota. Here's how it worked. Participants, all college students, were told they were helping test a new product evaluation system. They were shown a set of consumer items, things like toasters, clocks, radios, coffee makers. Nothing flashy, just basic household goods. Each participant was asked to rate how desirable each item was, using a simple numbered scale. Then came the decision point. The researcher told them, "As a thank you for participating, you get to take one of the items home." But here's the trick. They were asked to choose between two items they had rated almost equally, say a toaster and a small coffee maker, both originally scored around a 6 out of 10. So the decision was hard. There wasn't a clear favorite. They had to pick, knowing they might have preferred the other. After they chose, say, they picked the toaster, they were distracted for a bit with unrelated tasks. Then came the real test. They were asked to rate all the items again, including the two they had just chosen between, and something strange happened. The item they had picked, the toaster, now got a higher rating. The item they had rejected, the coffee maker, now scored lower than before, even though nothing had changed. This effect wasn't random. Across participant after participant, the pattern was the same. When forced to choose between two similar items, the chosen item became more desirable. The rejected item became less desirable. This became known as post-decisional spreading of alternatives. Why does this happen? Because the brain hates discomfort. Choosing between two similar options, especially when the decision feels arbitrary, creates something called cognitive dissonance. You think of yourself as rational, but when you make a decision with no strong reason, there's a mental itch. Wait, what if I picked wrong? To resolve that discomfort, your brain quietly rewrites your memory of how much you liked each item. It convinces you, I liked the toaster more all along, and you believe it. Genuinely. Over the years, the free choice paradigm was tested in deeper and more disturbing ways. In one study from the 1980s, researchers ran a version with political views. Participants were asked to rate political statements, then forced to choose between two they only mildly agreed with. After choosing, they were asked to re-rate them. Again, the statement they chose became something they now strongly supported. The one they rejected? They were suddenly more opposed to it. In another study, this was replicated with romantic choices, vacation destinations, and even moral dilemmas. The result held up every time. In 2009, neuroscientists tested the free choice paradigm on patients with anterograde amnesia, people who cannot form new memories. Patients were shown two paintings and asked to choose which they preferred. Then they were shown the same pair again and asked to choose again. Even though they didn't remember their original choice, they still showed the same preference shift. They liked their previous pick more, disliked the rejected one more. Their brains had rewritten their attitudes, even though they had no memory of making the decision. So what does this all mean? It means the human mind is not just a preference detector, it's a preference creator, especially after the fact. We don't just choose what we like what we chose. The free choice paradigm revealed a psychological sleight of hand we never notice. The moment you make a decision, your brain quietly starts changing the story, so you can live with it.